the day before 9/11, I took my son down to the South Street Seaport, which is not far from the Twin Towers. And my son had mentioned, he said, "Dad, why don't we go up to the top of the World Trade Center?" And as I looked at the buildings, to me it appeared that all the clouds around the building seemed to be dark and angry. And I looked at my son and I told him, "Papito, I don't think we need to go there. It seems like that's something that we should skip or do at another time." I mean, who would know that we would never be able to do that again? 9/11 was a Tuesday, and it was the primary day here in New York. And I was actually assigned to work the laddered tour, the 4 p.m. to 12 p.m. tour on 9/11. But and then I was going to service my own vending machines, which were at the World Trade Centers. I had in various stores, I had vending equipment. So I figured I'll do that in the morning, then I'll do my job. But that night they called and they said everybody's been reassigned, so we all had to go do a day tour. So now, that was for the election detail, yeah. So that meant that I had to be in at 7:30. Now for me that's really bad because I don't like working day tours. Never did, still don't like to get up early in the morning. That's why I work for myself. But the next day, got up, got in, went to work. On that particular day I was working with a fellow Detective Phil Hanna, and we got into the van, my van, and I call it my van because it was assigned to community affairs, but I really treated it like it was my van. Nobody could use it. And unfortunately, somebody had used it, and they left it dirty. And since I was in community affairs, I said, I cannot have a vehicle that represents the police department in this condition. So we took the van first, before going to our assigned detail, to the authorized car wash, which was on Bushwick and around DeSoto Street. Now, if you know Brooklyn at all, you know that that's like a hill. So it goes up, and that actually has the highest point. The park that's there is called Highland Park for that particular reason, because it's the highest point in Brooklyn, so you can see everything. While we're at the car wash, oddly enough, the police van got stuck in the car wash. I don't know why, but it did. So we were standing by just waiting there for them to be able to get my van out of this car wash. And as that occurred, I turned around and I saw the first plane strike the first tower. And immediately you heard chatter over the radio that the building had been struck and they didn't know what it was. Well, I turned to my partner and I said, "Phil, a big airplane like that flying into the tower, that can only be one thing, and that's terrorism." It was very surreal because it seemed almost like the plane was moving in slow motion. Like you could see it coming, and you're looking at it and saying, "Is it going to hit the building?" And when you saw the impact, then it became very real.
Right.
And even as the smoke was billowing out of the first tower, until you saw the second plane coming, it really again seemed very surreal. It seemed almost like something that you would see in a special effects movie.
Right.
Because you're watching it and you're seeing this plane coming in and you know it's moving very fast. But it seemed almost like it was in slow motion, just coming frame by frame by frame. And I'm just watching this plane and it just strikes the building. And you see the explosion and you see the fireballs coming out of the side of the building. And now you see the two towers both engulfed in flame. You can see the flame pretty clear. And we're in Brooklyn. So that's quite a distance away. And you could see the devastation, and the smoke just started to billow out of both of these towers. One of the first things was, to notify Central that these things had occurred, and so that they could start making their proper notifications. And like I said, immediately everybody was told, over the radio to get back. Although we had already assumed that we knew we had to get back to the command. All the other officers were starting to gather. And as we were watching the television and we had the radio on. And as we were watching this, all of a sudden the first tower begins to collapse. And this was very traumatic for us because one of the officers that worked with us, her brother was a fireman. And she knew that he had responded to this event. And all of a sudden you could hear the officers who were trapped in the building calling for help. It was one of the most helpless moments I've ever experienced in my entire life, because, you know, unless I wore a Superman suit, there was no way I was going to take off 110 stories worth of debris off of a building. But at that point, the only thing I could do was I got up, I turned the radio off, because I knew that that was just having a very negative effect. All the officers that were in that room were crying, and I'm not ashamed to say that, because you would have to be more than heartless not to understand what was going on. You know, they had already shown people jumping from the buildings, etc. So we already knew what was going on. We already knew, based on the radio chatter, that people were jumping from the buildings. So at that point, I told Sergeant Rodriguez, who was in charge of us, I said, well, Sarge, you know, there's no point in us being here. You know, I'm going to the site. You know, and I took the 3 officers that were with me, you know, Phil, Eddie, and Andy, and nobody said no. We just went to the van, and we took off. It was a controlled chaos. People knew that they had to get out from where they were. They knew that they couldn't stop to take a look because there were so many people behind them. So they had to keep moving. We were there for several hours before we finally realized that we weren't going to be able to do much. At that point, some of the officers who knew how to operate some of the heavy equipment commandeered some equipment, and I later came to find out that all that equipment belonged to I think it was Tully Construction. We knew what we needed to do, but we just couldn't do it. You know, it was just so much devastation. And then we didn't know if there was going to be any further explosions, because we kept seeing the smoldering, you know, that smoke just would go out. And you knew that there was fires burning under. That's what was fueling this, you know. So at a certain point, it became where the fire chiefs, if I recall correctly, began telling all of the officers and the firemen that we needed to evacuate the area. So that they could get a better assessment. We needed to make sure that no civilians were in the area. So at that point, you know, they started sending us out to make sure that everyone was out of that entire downtown area. The whole area had to be evacuated, because nobody knew what else was going to happen. We had no radios, communication. The only things that was working was landlines, because cell phone service was dead. You know, so I couldn't even call my family. I couldn't do anything to let them know that I was still alive. It wasn't until 3 days later that I finally was able to get home. Wow. That when I got home, my youngest son at the time was watching the news, and he was sitting there watching the news. He was crying because he couldn't believe, you know, what had happened. And of course, they hadn't heard from me in 3 days. And my wife was, you know, when I walked through the door, she just broke out crying, you know, and you know, everybody was excited that I was home, and to me, it just seemed like, okay, you know, I'm safe now. That was the first moment out of the first 72 hours of the entire incident that I actually felt safe. But it was for a very brief moment, because we had just an opportunity to go home for a moment. There's a lot of things I've chosen to forget. Yeah. You know, it's like an old toy, you know. You treasure it, but you really don't want to use it anymore. Yeah. And I think what has helped me to put a lot of this behind me is the fact that even with my friends, I do more listening than I do talking. I find that I prefer the listening, because when I talk, then I have to relive it. And even throughout my police career, no matter what great arrest I made or whatever, I never spoke much about what I did. I had my partners who would tell the story for me. They were much better storytellers. And but I just didn't want to relive certain things. You know, as a matter of fact, my family never really knew what I did until 9/11. One thing I will say is that one good thing that came out of it was that I had a chance to have lunch with my brother. during the cleanup and all that stuff that was going on, since he worked in that area, and once they were allowed back in the buildings, we made a point to have lunch. And I think that for the first time, my brother came to realize what it is that I do and the danger that was involved in it. And I knew that he was proud of me.